Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I am Oscar Gomez. I'm the CEO and founder at Sojago, as well as your presenter today. We will move over into the next section and start talking a little bit about the webinar overview. Let's jump in. So today, like I said, I'm going to start by reviewing some key terms specific to sort of storytelling and what we're going to be doing. I'm going to review some terms related to belonging and health equity, team management, so that we have a working definition. Again, we've shared those before. Then we're going to go into sort of, when you jump in, how do you begin crafting the story, right? It's called the situational context. And this is where we really sort of look at the message and the emotions, right? And we start putting the story together. We'll talk about narrative structure. We'll talk about storyboarding. And so we'll go into sort of a traditional approach to how stories are written, whether you're in business or creative arts, but we'll start sort of putting this together in terms of creating a story with data in the context of some DEI related situations, specifically around fostering a culture of belonging, activities that sort of, or work that advances health and racial equity, and or just becoming, positioning yourself as an employer of choice, an employer where people want to work, a good place, great place to work because of its commitment to DEI. Once we do that in the storyboarding, we're also going to refer to some data visuals, right? Because obviously in the storytelling, we don't want to tell the data, we want to show the data. So we're going to talk a little bit about some tips around that. So it's both a little bit, we're going to try to connect this with emotions and message. I'm going to talk about the call to action. What is the end purpose of why you're sharing these stories? We'll spend some time on what story to tell. We're going to take all of this information that we talked about and then put them into scenarios around topics of belonging, a good place to work, and health equity. We'll make some comments around credibility and transparency in terms of presenting the story. And then finally, we'll have some wrap up, we'll answer questions and next steps. So let's move into some of the content. So we're going to begin by reviewing some definitions around narrative and narrative change. So one thing to keep in mind is the narrative is a compilation of stories about people. So it's like any set or group of items, it's a compilation based on common themes, common values, and revisions. Narratives are either assembled or identified or observed, right? The next we're going to talk about is narrative change. And narrative change or narrative building, it requires an intended goal or outcome. It's intentional and it's strategic. I think if you attended our last webinar, we gave some examples around narrative change and narrative and how they're tied into examples of sort of these strategies applied during many civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s. So given that we just finished up Pride Month, I'll give an example again of sort of the narrative change approach that Harvey Milk, if you're used, Harvey Milk is an LGBTQ icon, and he was a politician, first openly gay elected politician. In any case, what he did with narrative change is that he realized that one way to really counter a lot of the anti-LGBTQ legislation of the 70s and 80s and sort of the hostility that was coming up from conservative America, he really decided that the important thing is to change the narrative, the dominant narrative about who LGBTQ folks were. And he really encouraged people to tell their own story, right, of coming out and what it meant, so that there was a change in sort of what the dominant narrative was, so that people started revealing concealed stories, concealed narratives. And that was a strategy of how to sort of counter dominant narratives. That's a super quick condensed overview of what narrative change is, but I just wanted to set the structure. And I want you to think about the stories that you tell in this context as a narrative change strategy. So think about what is the prevailing narrative or the dominant narrative of whatever it is that you want to change. If you're looking at sort of addressing fostering a culture of belonging, think of what is the current narrative? What are the current themes in the company organization that you are working or trying to address? What's the narrative change? And sort of to then think about what's the change that you want to see in that narrative? What's the ownership? What's the shift that you want to see? And this applies to any topic that you are looking at, whether it's health equity, whether it's recruitment and retention. So think about that concept. We'll come back to this a little bit. So again, I've been referencing the three situations that will sort of the context of which we'll talk about stories. And again, a review, fostering a culture of belonging. It's about aligning and building high-performing teams by prioritizing connection and shared purpose. One thing that really resonated for folks at the last webinar that I want to remind people is that belonging requires comfort or safety. And that means people knowing that they can be exactly who they are wherever they go. It requires connection, connecting with others, which is a basic human need that we have. And it's about contribution. So people can understand what their shared purpose are and how they contributed to success and a shared vision. And one thing to keep in mind about culture of belonging in stories, remember that sort of, it's a quote by, I believe it's Brene Brown, and she captures it in a nutshell. She says, the greatest barrier to belonging is trying to fit in. And so when you look, if this is where you're looking at in terms of addressing storytelling, remember, look at sort of what are the current narratives. Most narratives are about this is who we are, and here's how you try to fit in. Any story that would be a dominant narrative, right? Stories that talk about here's our workplace culture, and we want people to do this, and we want you to take cues from what you see here and try to fit it. That's not belonging. That's sort of I'll go and say that's sort of an old school model of an old dominant narrative that we're seeing change more and more. Talent management is really becoming a trusted employer of choice in order to recruit, retain, and grow talent. So think of talent management. It's similar to belonging. It's sort of belonging is sort of the foundation for it, but it's also sort of what is the employee experience from recruitment to the exit and even beyond. What relationship do they have with the organization once they leave? So stories that sort of capture that experience. And then when we talk about health equity, health equity there's many dimensions to it, but I do want to remind folks that health equity, if you look at it, is actually rooted in data. Health equity is about disparities, disparities in outcomes, disparities in power, disparities in opportunity, income inequality. So there's lots of data in there. And so this is a tricky one. We'll try to address this more. But the main thing I want to say is that if you're looking at stories to advance health equity, I really encourage you to look at stories that address more than one inequity. So you're talking about income inequality, stories that address also disparities in power. But really, we'll get about this more. So stories less about sort of the plight or the situation and moving more about stories about hope. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So now that we have sort of reviewed the foundation of these definitions, let's get into a little bit more of the storytelling. All right, so we are getting here. Now that we've reviewed some of the terms, let's jump into crafting stories with data. And what we do, this is called really the situational context. And maybe don't focus so much on the term, but it's just a process. And these are 4 questions that are really important to address and come back to as you're crafting the story, right? So first and foremost, you want to go back and think about, are you telling a story around, are you looking at stories about belonging, stories to foster employee experience, or equity? So with that context, you answer these 4 questions. And I believe in your workbook, there's a page or 2 where you can jot down notes. And I encourage you to just think of a situation. Are you looking to stories about equity, stories about belonging, and answer these questions? And even more, if you want to share some of your answers in the chat, that'd be great. But when you set up the situational context, you want to first start with your audience. What do you know about your audience? So for example, if I were telling a story, if I were presenting to a mixed audience of, say, community-based organizations and potential funders, private foundations or donors, I'd want to think of, define who they are. There's 2 of them, right? So think about what else do you know about their audience? What are their priorities? You've done some research maybe on the organizations they represented, or if it's internal in your own company, even better. You know a little bit more about the potential folks that you will be trying to influence. Once you've done that, then answer the question, what does your audience care about as it relates to your topic or subject, right? What are the things that they most care about? What is that they want to see? What is the change that they want to see? So again, if you can, jot down some of these notes. The third question that's really important to answer in a situational context is, what kind of tone would your audience be most receptive to? Right, this is really important. This goes to the what you know about your audience and sort of the emotional connection. I will say that in general, I would encourage you to lean towards tones and emotional connections that rely on things like hope, vision, potential change, optimism. It's essentially called it's sort of asset-based storytelling versus deficit-based storytelling. I think it's changing quite a bit, but just 10 years ago, a lot of folks would tell, especially around health equity, folks tended to lean into stories and data that really talked about sort of the plight of certain situations. My background is in community and public health, and when I first started, we did a lot of work with populations that migrant populations, farm workers, people experiencing homelessness. And I recall at the time, a lot of stories about them was about the plight of farm workers and how difficult. And while that's all valid and true, one, it's one-dimensional, those one-dimensional stories, and two, I don't know that those necessarily inspire people towards action. And so instead, you want to look about stories of hope and change. What is it about farm workers? What's the changes they want to see? What contributions do they make to society, right? I recall working with farm workers. They're very proud of working with the earth and feeding the greatest nation on earth. But in that, they had real challenges in terms of their living and working conditions. So anyway, and all of this saying, when you're looking at the tone of your audience and what tone you want to convey, I strongly encourage you to lean into emotions around hope, change, vision, optimism. That doesn't mean that you have to sort of ignore the plighting situation. That's where your data comes in, but the tone is really to be positive and action-oriented. And then finally, the question that you want to address is, how do you plan to engage with your audience? And just jot down notes. And this could be by sharing anecdotes, quotes, scenarios. Are there key questions you want to ask? And let's say, for example, that there may not be a definitive call to action that you have yet, but maybe you want to leave your audience with questions to consider. And so be strategic as to when you're going to place those questions into your story. Now, we're going to talk about sort of how do you assemble all this. But again, before you begin, this is where I encourage, before you jump in and tell the story, it's important to begin with the situational context. Answer these 4 questions. All right, so now that we've answered those questions, we want to talk about the storyboard. And the storyboard is, like it says here, it's probably the single most important thing you can do at the beginning, after you've answered the questions, to really craft your message and your story, especially if you're really leaning into data, right? I strongly recommend beginning with by working on the storyboard. It's essentially a visual representation, or if you will, an outline of the story you want to tell. You look at what the storyboard can help you do is to create the structure, the narrative structure. It can help you sort of give you a visual representation of where you want to insert your data and your messages. Again, emotional connection and your final call to action. One thing I do want to stress about this is that assembling the storyboard and crafting your story is not a linear process. And I share that because as I was preparing this, not just the slides, but also presenting, I kept going back and forth, and I realized that I remember to really stress that it's not a linear process. And so you'll notice with this presentation as we go forward that we're going to be going back and forth with it, similar to when you're crafting a story and presenting it, right? So that's essentially what your storyboard does. Now, a couple of things when you're putting together the storyboard. First of all, I would say stick to simple drawings, play with the narrative structure until it feels right. But you also, in order to keep everything together, what I would do is, like it says here, do visual representations of the story that you want to do. And again, simple stick drawings, if that's the best you can do, that's fine. If you want to do drawings with a few little words and stuff, that's good too. But then what you want to start organizing information is that I would suggest jotting down key data insights, say on a green Post-it note, right? So you have that color coded. And then any anecdotes or questions that you want to ask that about engagement or that emphasize emotional connection, say you want to jot those down on pink Post-it notes. Or if there's, again, a call to action that you know you're building up to, put it on different Post-it notes. And so once you have the storyboard assembled, what you can do is you go back to the notes and you see the story, and you can take any data insights and you can place them on what scene, what image, what scenario in the story does that data insight make most sense, and you start placing that on your storyboard. The same with your emotional connection. As you start crafting the story, and you start realizing, okay, here's an opportunity to really sort of drive something home about the challenges that you're trying to address, or the vision or the hope that you're trying to inspire. Capture that on a Post-it note and put it on your storyboard. And again, we'll come back to this. Again, it's not a linear process. Once you put this together, go back and read the story aloud, start crafting the story, again, with some of your messages and some of your emotions, some of the data. And I encourage you to play around with the structure until it feels right. And again, think of this as a draft story that you're telling. But this is, to me, probably well, it seems a little bit complicated. It's actually, by doing the visuals, I think it's the best way to start with the story. Okay, now we're going to go into the data. And one thing, I want to pause here and really emphasize that one thing that occurred to me while I was putting this together is that it's important to demystify for folks what storytelling with data is. Sometimes terms people think of data storytelling as opposed to storytelling with data, and data storytelling can be different things. But in general, if you Google data storytelling, you talk to folks, data story tends to be it's more of a discipline. It's data analytics. It's if you want to, for lack of a better term, it's sort of a data wonk, somebody who delves into that. For example, I'm not necessarily, that is not my strength, data analysis, although I can do that. But so we're not talking about data storytelling or data analytics. That process is called exploratory analysis, when you're jumping into the data and you want to sort of explore what is the data saying, right? Then the second part of that is explanatory analysis, which is what storytelling is about. Explanatory analysis is the process of explaining and communicating what you found insightful, noteworthy, or interesting. So I want to stress this point a few times. When you're presenting or telling a story with data around these things, you really want to lean into the exploratory analysis and not the explanatory analysis and not the exploratory analysis. That's where you can really lose folks. It kind of zaps the emotion of your message. So we'll talk about that. You do want to stress a little bit of sort of, limitations of the data or transparency, but you don't, storytelling with data, it's not about telling the story of the process and how you explore the data. It's really about what is the data saying? What are the insights that you want to communicate through a story? And so I can't stress that enough. It's an explanatory analysis. That's what storytelling with data really comes down to. When you're looking at the data and you've explored it and you're getting some insights, you could probably talk about them at length, but to the extent that you can capture your data insights into one or two sentences that fit in onto a Post-it, then that's how much that can really sort of help you be more concise and insightful and specific when you share these insights with your audience. And this is really important to do for someone like me that tends to be big picture and likes to share concepts and stuff. That process is super helpful for me because my tendency is to want to explain a lot, give context, tell the story, right? But when you're looking at data insights, I really go back and forth over and over until I can capture data insights onto a Post-it note. On occasion, maybe two, but really down to one Post-it note. and then place it on the storyboard. Otherwise, your messages and call to action data can get a little confusing and convoluted. Now what we're going to talk about is, so you put together the storyboard, you started crafting the story, you know, the emotions that you want to connect, the insights. So you've crafted that, and now you're going to present this story. Now this is an assumption that when you're doing your storytelling with data, that there's going to be a live audience. It's not something that you are necessarily going to be, it's not written down, right? It's either going to be a live audience or a recording. And so when you're doing that, you're going to most likely use visuals. In fact, I encourage you to use visuals, if anything, just for the data. And here's a couple of things to really consider when you are using visuals, right? And the visuals that you choose to add should do one or more of these three things. It should either simplify complex or lengthy data to make it easier to understand. The visual should focus attention on key data that you want your audience to remember, and/or the visual that you use should reinforce key messages or the call to action. So the visuals, you should do one or more of these things and nothing else. If it doesn't accomplish one of these things, consider it clutter. It's going to detract from the story, right? And detract from the message. So again, these are the three very straightforward guidelines for the visuals that you'd like to use. So now we're going to talk about types of visuals. And I went back and forth as to how much time to spend on this, but I realized that that because we're talking about sort of storytelling, we talked before, that perhaps tips on visuals would in fact be very helpful for folks. And really, when you're talking about visuals, to also keep it simple, I recommend sticking to a handful of simple visuals. There's so many types of visuals and graphs that you could use. If you're doing storytelling, I encourage you to keep it as simple as possible, very straightforward. And so I'm going to basically share just a handful of what those visuals are and what they mean, and sort of in situations as to when I recommend using them, when I've used them before. And so let's just jump into it. So there's tables, and you'll see here, the thing about tables is to remember that tables engage with how we interact verbally or written with others, right? Because tables require us to read and analyze the look. So they're going to be that sort of logic side of the brain. And remember, what you're doing with the tables, you want to direct your audience attention to a specific concept, to a specific information. The thing about tables is that you want to be very selective as to when you use it, because you can lose your audience with tables. Because, for example, if you've got a variety of people in the audience, like I mentioned earlier, say foundations and CBOs, people are going to immediately try to look for that line or that bar or that column in the table that applies to them. So if you're going to use a table, don't make it too complicated. Just have a couple of columns and rows. Otherwise, you're going to have people spending so much time looking for that information. Graphs are a little bit easier because they interact with our visual. They're very straightforward. I tend to lean into graphs, tables not so much. And then finally, simple text. Oftentimes we tend to think that storytelling with data requires these elaborate graphs or visuals, and I think it's just the opposite. You want something simple. And simple text, as it explains, it's just that. You hear 400% visuals have been found to improve learning by up to 400%. You see how powerful that is? That number says it all, right? And so there's so many things you can do with that when you're telling your story. So I'm a big fan of simple text when you're talking about storytelling and data. Other types of visuals that I think are great for that are effective and simple to use in storytelling with data, and they're line graphs. The thing to remember about line graphs is that they're particularly effective to communicate trends over time, right? So it's either increasing or decreasing. They will most likely address changes you want to see. Your heat maps are also very powerful in very powerful visuals. They're sort of a combination of tables and graphs, but they draw people's attention to color, right? It's a visual representation of data, that shows the magnitude or frequency of the data that you are communicating. And they can be highly effective at drawing your audience attention to specific data, as well as your call to action. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a linear process, but we're going to try everything together towards the end. But when you're thinking about the visuals, also think about, where you want to draw your audience's attention. So essentially, if your call to action is going to be to change funding mechanisms for community-based organizations, make it simple, you definitely want that heat map to represent your call to action, right? Of say, for example, if you did a survey and people responded to these type of questions are easiest and most helpful, you want a heat map that sort of captures that, right? And then there's bar graphs. I won't read all of that to you, but again, bar graphs are also very, very simple and straightforward. Again, what I like about them is that they engage with us visually, and they're great to compare multiple categories. A couple of tips with all of these. I encourage you not to complicate them. Like we usually tend to want to make things fancy. I'm not a fan of like 3D bar graphs or heat maps that have many colors, because while they may look impressive, they detract from your story and they detract from your message. They can confuse people. So you want something that's very straightforward. That again, the key thing is you want to focus on the narrative structure and your call to action, and the emotional connection, and visuals are there simply to amplify those things, right? Now we're going to talk about visual data for qualitative data, which is what I think can be the most. I'm a big fan of visuals for qualitative data in storytelling, because this is really where you can build that connection. You can reinforce messages, you can reinforce emotions here. And while they may not necessarily be looked at as as salient or meaty as, say, quantitative data, for the purposes of storytelling, for the concept that we talked about, especially around belonging, especially around health equity, qualitative data is really important, and visuals can even enhance that more. And so I've just shared with you 3 simple visuals that you can use for storytelling, that I'm a big fan of. And one of them is the word cloud. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with them. They're also called, well, I don't think, okay, the visual is called word cloud. The process is called, they call it sentient analysis, which when I first heard about it, I thought, wow, this must be a very complicated process, but it's not. There's different apps and softwares. I think there's, I'm not even sure if Microsoft Word is able to do this, but if you type in word cloud or sentient analysis, there's different websites that can help do that. Essentially, what a word cloud does is a visual representation of data, of words that appear in themes. And what it captures is either by it captures frequency of terms that appear, either by size or color or font. And I think these are great to use specifically around when you want to get solicit emotions around belonging, right? What words appear. Sometimes in brand, which we're not necessarily addressing today, but I'll tell you, I've used them before. When have I used it? With some organizations that were really trying to sort of change internally the narrative about who they were as an organization. And they did a lot of work. They were a social service organization that did a lot of work in the community around mental health, around keeping families together. So they worked a little bit with the legal system. They did some adoptions. They also worked. So they did a lot of social service, a lot of community work, a lot of it working on people. And so, but there was a disconnect. They felt that, they kept saying, well, we don't really do health equity, because they kept talking about process. So what we did with that is we took some of their key terms. We took some of the, I think, literature, say from that they sent out to funders, things that talked about the work that they did, the impact, and I just put them into sort of this sentient analysis. And what came up is that they had terms over and over that said services, legal, applications, service area, words that this is what appeared over and over on their websites, on their recruitment literature, on information to funders. And that's where they started seeing the disconnect in terms of how they saw themselves and how others saw them. Because you'll see most of those words did not inspire an emotional connection. They didn't talk about sort of the human work, the human aspect that they do. So then we looked at it. We took stories of, I interviewed some of their staff. They talked about sort of the work they did, and they talked about sort of families that they helped. And we jotted down notes. We did other processes, right? When we did the word cloud for that, all of these other words came up. The frequency of it, family, connection. I forget the terms, but you'll see that essentially saying what word clouds can do. I'm a big fan of them in terms of qualitative data. Now, I wouldn't use word clouds alone, but word clouds or something similar can really capture. They're even a great analysis to do internally if you want to look at sort of if your recruitment literature or employee satisfaction, anything like that, to see what words come up and then to share. The other visual or Venn diagrams, you're probably familiar with them. I won't spend too much time on them, but I'll say that they can be very effective for belonging and inclusion, because when you want to address multiple concepts, when we talked about belonging, I emphasized that belonging, there's three things to it. It's comfort and safety, where people know that they can be exactly who they are without a focus fitting in. The other component is connection, how do folks feel connected to their fellow staff, to their community, whatever. And then the third one is a shared purpose or contributions. So because there's three concepts there, Venn diagrams, depending on the analysis, can be great to capture information of those three categories. They're also very effective if you're presenting data around equity, racial or health equity, again, because there's so many different drivers and dimensions. And then finally, again, user quotes. Now, user quotes may not be specific data as we think about it, but in terms of a presentation, they're highly, highly effective because they humanize your data. As it says here, quotes are often used to support claims, illustrate ideas, and help readers understand the data. I think they can be very strategic, right? And you don't want to necessarily overdo it, but quotes can be peppered in throughout your presentation. Maybe perhaps after if you presented data that may feel a little dry, you can put in quotes in there about that amplify the data. And again, lean into quotes that really capture hope, vision, optimism, change, that are asset focused, right? As opposed to deficit focused. So I feel like I spent a little bit too much time on that, but visuals are such an important part of this. Finally, when you're telling storytelling with data, what's the purpose? Why are you telling the story? What is the change you want to see? And that's when you craft your call to action. Essentially, what is the change you want to see? And what can your audience do to make that happen? Now, the call to action is going to appear towards the end of your story or presentation, but a good story, good presentation around this is building up to your call to action. So when you go back to your storyboard, you put a little note as to what data and or message is going to reinforce that call to action that you're going to place towards the end, right? And again, three simple guidelines for call to action. A call to action is specific and direct. It shouldn't be situational. If you find this, then you should do this. No, you want a very specific call to action. My call to action with you here is that when you're preparing stories, end it with the call to action, right? That's my message here. Your call to action should can benefit or highlight benefits. Make it clear as to why this call to action is important and what is the outcome? How are things going to get better, improve, or move folks towards a shared goal or shared vision? And then finally, you want your call to action to be actionable, that people can do it, that can execute it, right? So you don't necessarily want a call to action for your community if the call to action is about seeing a set of legislations or policies that need to happen in order to. Your audience can't do anything about that. So that is not a matchup with your call to action. If you're presenting, say, to elected officials or policy analysts, maybe, right? So you want to make, again, this goes back to knowing your audience and capturing it. So your call to action is what you end with, and it should capture one of these 3 things or more. And at the end, you want to go back to what kind of story do you want to tell? Stories that will foster a culture of inclusion, um, position you as employer of choice, stories to advance health equity. And so a couple of examples that I want to point out here. When you're telling stories of belonging, again, I encourage you to look at things like word clouds, quotes. Maybe sources of data could be employer satisfaction surveys. If you haven't done those, maybe do short focus groups, right? Have informational interviews with staff. If you're going to do that, you probably want somebody who understands how to interview and how to capture that data because you want consistency. But I'm just trying to give you an idea as to how you capture, where you capture this data. And again, when you present that story, tell stories that are about shared connection or shared purpose and shared success. Those are great stories to tell around for culture of belonging. For talent management, again, employee satisfaction surveys can be very insightful for data. And you want to think about this as the experience of employees from the recruitment process to their exit interview. What's it like to work at your organization? What makes it unique? I encourage you to tell stories about the intangibles, right? You can talk about stories about the success in the work you do, but that's not going to separate you from other employers. You want maybe lean into stories about intangibles such as, employee wellness, about how you care for the whole person, right? That, first, people there aren't just sort of, we talk about human resources, but you want to talk about the human part of it, right? The folks are not just resources, they're people, right? You care about their health and well-being, stories around that. Stories about how there's opportunities for advancement, stories about opportunities, how you share leadership or power with your staff, things that make you stand out and why people would want to work with you. If this is the story that stories that you want to tell about this, the one thing to keep in mind in your situational context are stories that are aligned with values that show shared values between your organization and the people that work for you and the people that you want to recruit. If you really want to dig into it deeper, a lot of folks are looking at sort of what is it that Gen Z, for example, what is it they're looking for in an employer versus that stands out different from millennials or Generation X like me. Gen Z, really, it's important for them to work for a company that stands for something, that puts out their values out there, right? So in any case, I know I'm going into a lot, but that's where you get sources of the data, and that's what it means to know your audience. Who's you're recruiting, what do they care about? And if you're going to tell stories to advance health equity, again, you want narratives that are stories of hope and empowerment and vision. And really, unless it's really necessary, to stay away from stories about that I call the plight of a situation or the hardships. See if you can communicate those things indirectly, but really lean into stories about change. One last word I want to say is credibility and transparency when you're telling your story. We talked about exploratory and explanatory analysis. So you don't have to go into the methodology. And in fact, I encourage you not to do that. But you do want to say a couple of things, whether it's at the beginning or at the end of the presentation. Share any limitations in the data. You could say that this data was collected basically mostly through interviews, right? Because you hadn't been able to do an employee satisfaction, or say your employee satisfaction survey is 3 years old, share that, right? It's okay to do that. It gives you that credibility and transparency. I encourage you to share what you personally learned from both the story and the data. As you're crafting this, weave those anecdotes into the story in the middle or towards the end. Again, it makes it relatable, engages, and it adds to your credibility. And always share the source of the data. Footnotes or endnotes are fine. And again, find that balance. You don't need to lean into the methodology, but you do want to give enough so that folks understand how you use the data. We are wrapping up here. Here's a little list of sort of the services that we provide. I do want to we're leading into more storytelling services. We are going to be doing a DEI storytelling online learning cohort. Probably going to start around August, and it's going to include a team building plus 4 virtual workshops focused on peer learning and coaching. we'll tell you more about it. We will be recruiting 3 or 4 more people for focus groups or interviews to help us with the content, but I'll reach out to you. This tells you more about it. You can hop on our website. I do want to remind folks that at the end, later today, you'll be receiving a survey to give us feedback about the process. It's very, very important to us. We talked about data. It really helps us a lot. And then if you attended this workshop and you completed the survey, as we've done before, you are welcome to book for 1 hour, no cost, just conversation with me about anything we talked about today or anything related to storytelling. So please, please, please encourage you to complete that. I want to end by thanking you for joining us. Thank you for your time and attention. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week and the holiday week, and that it's safe and enjoyable. And I want to thank everybody much, and we'll be in touch soon.